It is good to be here again and to worship with you. Just thinking through that last song and just the words that are there are just so true, just where our world is at today. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what we can do with it. You know, in the song, I think, used the word lethargy and just being like, hey, we just need to get out. We need to go and to do the things that God has given us, because he has given us this kingdom hope. As Lisa and I, the last 2 years, have been involved in Muslim ministry right here in Detroit, just meeting person after person after person who has no idea who Jesus is, no idea of the hope that the gospel brings as they strive and they work hard to try to earn their way to paradise. But they can't do it. We can't earn our way there. And they're going the wrong path altogether. So it's great to be here and just to worship with you and even just reflecting on those words. So my wife Lisa and I have served with Sen for 23 years. When we left with Sen, we had no idea that we would be here in Detroit working with Muslims. Our heart was with Chinese. When we were at Michigan State University, began meeting Chinese professors and Chinese scholars, and they would get off the plane in the late 80s, early 90s, and at that point, China was very, very closed, to the West, and they'd get off the plane and say, "Do you believe in God? Why do you believe in God? How can I believe in God?" And just had all these questions. And as we are in our undergrad there, meeting these guys in their 40s and 50s and 60s, asking all these questions about the gospel, God got a hold of our heart and said, we want to serve Chinese people. And for Michigan State, we ended up at Dallas Seminary. And when we were there, we served at a Chinese church. We were the First Chinese Baptist Church of Dallas for about 5 years. And just kind of attending and helping where we could, and then ended up creating their youth program and becoming their youth pastor, for a number of years. But God had always given us that heart for Chinese. And then from the church in Dallas, ended up in Taiwan doing church planting, learning Chinese for a couple of years, more than a couple of years. That goes on forever. It started in Dallas at a little Chinese school on Saturday mornings it was us as, grad students, and then a whole bunch of 8-year-olds, sitting in a little classroom trying to learn Chinese, and this is not working well. So we got to Taiwan, and then we were able to really learn, kind of in context. When you're there and you have to speak in order to eat, then you learn very fast. So we served in Taiwan for 4 years, worked with the Hakka people, which is kind of one of the least reached peoples in Taiwan, and thought we'd be there forever. And then God had shifted us in ways that we didn't expect, and ended up in China. And we were in China for a year and enjoying ministry there, teaching English. Son had an English school at that point in China, and we would just minister to our students and just build into their lives, and seeing God begin to work, through that ministry. And then towards the end of that time, our youngest got really, really sick, and we had to come home. There was just no other option, and ended up in a hospital in Detroit and looking at each other and saying, we can't go back. What do we do? And began working with Send in our office right here, Farmington Hills, doing recruiting, kind of traveling around the country, talking with college students, saying, hey, here's what's going on in the world. You need to go. We did that for 10 years, something like that. And then as we began to see the Syrian refugee crisis unfold, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but began to move in our heart, and got involved in a task force saying, hey, what can we do in Europe? Let's work with the German church, and let's begin to reach out to these Syrian refugees that are coming out of Syria, and really get in their first time to be in a Christian environment or a place where they can engage with Christians and hear the gospel. But as we're, I'm on these committees and task force and doing these things, it's like, we want to do something. We know they're starting to come here. What do we do? And we ended up adopting a Syrian family with a group of friends. I picked them up from the airport and got their house ready and began to, it's kind of the daily task of bringing in a new family. And this is one of these typical Muslim families that we're learning with 8 kids. Mom was about 34 years old and had 8 kids from, at that point, 1 year old to probably 16, 17 years old. And so it's like, how do we get them from the airport? How do we get them into this little house, probably about 900 square feet in Detroit in a really bad neighborhood, telling the dad, do not go out at night. Don't go for a walk. You can't do that. Over there in Dearborn, you're okay. In Detroit, it's a different issue. But began to work with them and began to just get involved in their lives. And from that, we said, you know what, this is where God is leading us. Here are people that have no idea what the gospel is. And even though they're right in our midst, they're not going to go into a church. They're not going to engage a Christian. And most Christians are really afraid to engage with Muslims. One, you have the language barrier. Are they going to be able to understand English? How can I talk to them? You have the food barrier and all the customs of, do I look this lady in the eye? Can I shake her hand? What should I do? So you have all these different barriers. And then we have the news media and politics and just our culture in general saying, oh, be afraid. Don't engage. So they're kind of on their isolated island, and we're on our isolated island, and the two never really come together. And we said we need to do something about that. So we began working with churches, trying to help them to figure out how do we engage their neighborhood, how do we get them involved, and began working in the neighborhood in Detroit that they put a lot of refugees and a lot of immigrants who've been here for a long time, and began creating some different programs to kind of build bridges into their community. But so it's been a journey for us, one that we never would think or have ever thought, but we know that God is doing something. When we look at our world today, you can keep it on the slide for right now, but when we look at our world today, we know that our world is kind of divided into 3 groups of people. We call it kind of a world of thirds. 1/3 would call themselves Christian. They're probably not all believers. They don't really understand who Christ is, really haven't made Christ Lord of their life. But if you were to ask them, they'd say, yes, I'm a Christian. So many Europeans, many Americans would say yes. And they kind of fall in this category. They have access to the gospel. They have access to churches, and they would say, yes, I'm a Christian of one sort or another. Another third of our world lives in that context. They've had opportunities to hear the gospel. They have cousins who are Christian, or maybe they went to church as kids, and now they say, no, I don't want that. But that third of the world pretty much has said, no, I don't want the gospel. I know what that is. And we know, just being here in the States, that most Americans kind of fit within that. Even if they would kind of call themselves Christian, they said, no, I don't really want that. I don't want to spend time reading Scripture. I really don't want to put myself under the authority of Christ. And so we have about another third of the world is kind of in that situation in a variety of places. The last third of the world or so, maybe a little bit more, are in areas that they really don't have good access to the gospel. And these are people we call unreached. And we'd say that there are about 2% believers amongst them. And they're just not quite enough people, enough believers to really get a movement going, to really see the church get established. And many of our places in the world, we think of the Middle East, we think Central Asia, western parts of China where a lot of the minorities are kind of in that situation where there isn't a church down the street. There isn't a cousin who could explain the gospel to them. There isn't a friend that they could talk to. And in many of these places, there's not even access, on the internet to say, hey, they may search on Google and find out, who this Jesus is. All those things are blocked, and they just don't have those opportunities. What we find here in the States is that many of these people are beginning to come here. But many of them are living in places and are in communities that are still isolated, and they're still virtually unreached, even though they might be our neighbor, even though they might work, with us or be in our school. But there's still not this connection. It's still not this relational thing that is going on. But we're seeing God begin to move some of these people. What we want to look at today is a little bit of what God is doing when we think of these unreached peoples. For years, the church has sent people overseas, and we need to continue to do that. That is vital, vital. God said, go and make disciples. We have to go. We have to send people. But we're also beginning to see a great movement of God like we've never seen before, just in global migration. That God is moving people from places where there is no access to the gospel to places where they can have the opportunity to hear. As we look at global migration this morning and kind of how God is playing into that, many social scientists are calling today the age of migration, that there are more people on the move today than there had ever been. I think what I got down here, I was looking just yesterday, saying, okay, what are our current numbers? Right now, there's 244 million people who are living in a place that they weren't born. There's a lot of ways that people move, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but 244 million people are doing that. That's 3.3% of the world's population is living somewhere that they weren't born. That's not even including their kids or grandkids or kind of, second generation, 1.5 generation, people. But to see this massive movement of people. Yeah, go ahead and click down a little bit. So if we were to take all of these people, that's a different. So I got no clicker, so he's clicking. But if you take all of these people, take the 244 million people, and just to give it a little bit of perspective, it would be the 5th largest country in the world if all those people lived together. We think of the masses of China and India and the States and Brazil. The world's immigrant population is the 5th largest country in the world if we put them all together. This is a huge mass of people. And it includes today 22 million refugees. People who've been forced out of their homes through war or through famine in some way where they're beginning to be pushed out. And, not even including in that 244 million, we have 50 million internally displaced people. People who are within their country, but they can't live in their home. Like today when we look at what's going on between Turkey and Syria, kind of on this border where the Kurds are living and Turkey's beginning to attack, this area on a border, there's going to be just millions of people who end up getting displaced, of just kids and families that have lived there their whole lives, and all of a sudden they can't live there and they got to go live somewhere else. I mean, if you can imagine, Canada attacking Detroit, saying, we want a buffer zone with America. And all of a sudden, everybody in Detroit's got to move somewhere else. But there's really no other places for you to go. There's no other big cities or, it's just this massive movement of people that's getting pushed out. And that's what we mean by the internally displaced. But God is moving all of these people, for a variety of reasons. When we talk to social scientists, we say, why do people move? You can switch slides. We see that there's 2 big reasons why people move, when they look at it. And they say one is push. The people in, northern Syria, they're getting pushed down into different parts of Syria. They're going to get pushed down into Jordan. They're going to get pushed to other places. We look at the Syrian refugee crisis as a whole, and they've got pushed out. Things began to happen in their world where they were getting pushed. And then the other reason is pull. Sometimes people are just attracted to another country. There's educational opportunities, there's employment opportunities, there's reasons to come to America. We want to, look a little bit at both of these. When we look at push, go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to show you a picture of some of my friends from a picnic 2 summers ago. I think that one was, had just had this huge rainstorm, finally stopped, and we all sat down. But guys from Afghanistan, from Kurdistan, from Syria, I think that's all, and Iraq. They were there, and we had this picnic with kind of our Muslim friends out in Canton. And the wives were all inside, staying dry with the kids, but the dads we were all outside. And these guys were all pushed out of their countries. When we look at that push and pull, they were pushed. You kind of look through the picture, and on the far left, guy sitting down in the blue, he's a Kurd from northern Syria, which we call Kurdistan. He was never given papers in his country. Because he's a Kurd, he's not a person. There's no birth certificate. There's no marriage certificate. There was no visa, no registration card. In Syria, if you're a Kurd, you don't exist. You're the least of the least. We're not giving you any papers. We're never going to let you get education. He's never been to school in his life. Does not speak Arabic hardly at all. Just speaks a Kurdish language. When that country began to go to war within itself, and the president said, "Hey, Kurds, come fight for me and I'll give you papers." And all the Kurds went and got papers and said, "Yes, we'll fight for you. Please give us our papers." And he got his first papers, and then they all fled. So, okay, we got papers, now we can go to Turkey. Because if you don't have your ID card, if you don't have papers, you get to the border of Jordan to get out, you get to the border of Turkey, you can't leave. You're stuck. So they went to Turkey, lived there as refugees for a number of years, and then finally came here to the States. A little farther down towards the middle, a guy I call Abe, he was in Syria, just kind of living a normal life. And then one day he came home, and the houses around him were beginning to get blown up by missiles by his own country, his own people, and began to destroy that neighborhood. And he said, we've got to go now. So he took his kids and his wife and his mom and said, we've got to flee. We're going to go to Jordan. And he said his youngest son is kind of a pre-kindergarten age, probably at that point, just stood there and just wailed and wailed and wailed as he watched his house be destroyed and everything he knew burned down. And they went and they lived in a tent in Jordan for about 7 years. Couldn't work. So they'd go outside, and the Jordanese people would throw rocks at the kids and, didn't allow them to get education or, so they were in this place. A very middle-class guy. He's an entrepreneur. He owned 2 or 3 businesses in Syria. It's just kind of, hey, let me start a little business here. Let me start a little business there. It reminds me of a lot of my Chinese friends. It's like, yeah, we can start this business. And that's what he did. That's what he does. But got pushed out and said, you got to go to Jordan, and then ended up in Detroit. Not what they think of when they think of America. When the UN and they go through all the interviews of Homeland Security and the FBI and the CIA and all these people, we chose you, you're going to come to America. They're thinking Novi. They're thinking Farmington Hills, like it's going to be a middle-class neighborhood, a nice house with a yard and trees, and they'll probably have a car ready for me and, all these things. And they get to the airport and the trade airport, think, oh, this is pretty nice. And, things are good. And someone picks them up and say, here's your house in Detroit, 800 square feet, 900 square feet, don't go outside, you're hearing gunshots, and the neighborhood that they live in is a pretty rough neighborhood. And this is it. And your rent's, $1,000 a month. And we're going to help you out for 3 months, but after 3 months, you're on your own. Hope you got a job, hope you've got language, hope you've got everything figured out, because the resettlement agency only has to work with them for 3 months, and then they disappear, and then they're gone, and they're on their own. So that's Abe and his family and his wife and their 4 kids and grandma all live together in this little house. The next day, farther down from him is a guy from Afghanistan called Mo. he is an engineer. So when he got here and kind of struggled, you can't just go into engineering. Just because you're an engineer in Afghanistan doesn't mean you can be an engineer in America. There's certifications and there's things you have to do and stuff. So, you have that struggle. And there's another one with 5 or 6 kids and figuring out how do we survive, how do we make it. And he's been able to move along a little better than most. He's been able to get some English and actually is beginning to work as an engineer. But he's working right now in like South Bend or northern Indiana. And his family, his wife, who speaks no English and is very stuck at home, is here in Detroit with the kids, while he's working and trying to survive. But these stories continue and continue and continue. Afghans that have come this summer that we've just met and beginning to see them come in to the States. One's like, hey, the Taliban came to my house and said, we need your land and we need your house. We're going to build a mosque right here. He said, you can't. This is my livelihood. I live off the land. We need this. They said, no, we're not asking you. We are taking your land. We are taking your house. And if you resist, we'll take your head. And they went back to get a sword so they could cut off his head. And at that moment, he said, we're out. We got to go. And they grabbed a few things, headed off, and ended up in Pakistan and India for a number of years, and then eventually ended up in Sri Lanka. And that's where they lived as refugees and tried to go through the process and were there for 6-7 years before they were granted refugee status and allowed to come to the U.S. And they're here now. And we look at their lives, and social scientists look at their lives and say, why are they here? Because they were pushed out. Their country forced them out. They had to come out. Others, we see that there's more of a pull. My family came from Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because there was an attraction. There's opportunity in America. There are jobs in America. There's education in America. Many of your families, and perhaps many of you, kind of some of those same reasons. Say, hey, there's opportunities in America I can't get where I'm at. There's opportunities for education. There's opportunities for a better life to start over, maybe something better for our kids. Some of our new friends are from Morocco, and the Moroccans don't have a refugee or an asylum issue. They just have a lack of opportunity issue. So a lot of them get a diversity visa, and they come, and it's for opportunity. They're attracted to the States and what they can get here. And while there is this push and there is this pull, we know there's more going on than just that. And that's what we want to look at a little bit more this morning is, what is God doing in the midst of all this? What is God doing in the midst of all these wars and all just the craziness of our world at a time when there's more people on the move than at any time in our history? What is God doing? We want to look this morning at Acts 17, real briefly, just for a short passage that gives us a little insight into what God is doing when we think about global migration and this movement of people. So we'll turn to Acts 17, verse 26. We got it on the screen. You can look at your copy of God's Word. We want to look at just verse 26 and a little bit into 27. He says, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Let me read that one more time. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. This short passage is part of a bigger context. Paul is on a missionary journey. He's just fled from one of the cities where they're looking to harm him. Some places where Paul went and preached the gospel, people were really excited, and some would come to Christ. And often there was a group of people that said, no, this is not what they want, and they would try to kill Paul as he was going from city to city. when he's here, and this is happening in Athens, he's just kind of there waiting. He's just left the city, and his friend said, hey, we're going to come. We'll come and get you, but wait in Athens. It's a safe place for you to be, and we want you to wait. As he's in the city, he's wandering around, beginning to look, throughout Athens, and he begins to see all of these different idols. And the scripture earlier in this passage said his heart was distressed. As he was looking at these idols, he's distressed. So in my mind, it's like, okay, he ended up in Taiwan, and he's just like, let me just wander around Taichung for a little bit, and he's going from place to place, and he's like, wow, look at all of these idols. And his heart, it just begins to be burdened and this distressed. And that's kind of what it was like in Athens at that time, this religious place where they just worshipped anything and everything. And as he's wandering, he begins to see this. His heart is down, and he begins to preach the gospel. Even though his friends are like, just wait there, just kind of be the tourist, don't do anything, don't stir up commotion, but because his heart and because of who Paul is and because of what God has done in his life, he said, you know what, I need to begin to share. So he'd go into the temples, as he normally would, and then he began to talk to people on the street. And it says that he found a kind of an idol or a blank inscription, that says to the unknown God. So they have all these different gods that they worship, and then there's this one spot where it says, this is to the unknown God. We're going to worship this unknown God because maybe we missed one. Maybe there's a God we just don't know about, and we don't want him to be mad at us and to, because we didn't worship him. So he goes to them and preaches this sermon and says, I want to make known to you who this unknown God is. And this passage is part of that sermon, part of this Paul trying to explain the gospel and what God is doing to people with no Jewish background. Typically when we see Paul preach to Jews, he's starting with Adam or Abraham, and he kind of goes through the Old Testament and comes, here is your Messiah, and it shows how Jesus is the Messiah. Here he's got to start at a different point. So if you ever think, how do I share the gospel with someone who has no religious background at all? Look at this sermon later in Acts 17 and say, okay, here's one way we do this. How do we explain who God is? But right in the midst of this, we see this passage that he's made one man from every nation, from one man, every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. And he having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. And I want to look at these phrases. You can switch slides. The first phrase I want to look at is this allotted periods. It says that God has determined allotted periods. What is that? That is time. That God has determined that these people, that this person, that you and me are alive and we're living at this time in history. Sometimes some of us think, man, I was born too late. I should have been born, 50 years ago or, at a different period of history. But God says, no, I have you here right now. And as we look at what God is doing, as we look at this mass migration, as we look at him moving people, God is saying, now is the time I want to do that. This isn't by accident. This isn't just because there's a crazy crisis in Syria and soon to be in Iran and, what's going on in North Korea or Burma or these different places. But God is saying, I've determined, I've set that this is the time when these things are going to happen. They're not out of God's control. As we continue to look at that passage, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. The boundaries of their dwelling place is just location. That it's not an accident that you and I are living here in Farmington Hills, Metro Detroit, that God has put us here. It's not an accident that, students are at the schools that they're at or that you're working in the job that you're at. God has placed you there for a reason at this time. And as we look at global migration, we see that it's not an accident that God has moved these Syrians and Moroccans and Lebanese and Afghans and so many other people that at this time they are going to live in Metro Detroit. It's not an accident that Farmington has had this massive change over the last 20 years from being a very, very white middle-class community to becoming a little India. You know, a couple of years ago, I was on a plane coming back from Dallas, visiting some churches down there, and I was sitting next to a 20-something Indian guy from India, kind of well-to-do guy, and he's just traveling around the U.S., seeing his friends, seeing people, and he's just coming back, I think, from L.A., and he was heading towards Michigan, and he's like, oh, where do you live? And I'm like, oh, I live in Detroit, because no one knows Farmington, you know, and he goes, oh, where in Detroit? And I'm like, well, I live in Farmington. He goes, oh, Little India. He had heard in India about Farmington. You know, every new business that starts in Farmington is a new Indian restaurant, is a new Indian grocery store, is a place to get your eyebrows waxed, or, you know, whatever. It's all of these new, you know, businesses are starting. It's just seeing the Indians begin to come in. All those apartments on Grand River, they're 90%, you know, Indians from India. Longacre Elementary School in that neighborhood is a good half Indian. You know, last year we were somewhere with our son who went to Longacre his whole kind of elementary career, and we walked into an Indian grocery store or restaurant, and he just could smell the curry and that smell of India, and he goes, hey, that smells like my school. You know, and so, I mean, that's what is going on, that God is moving people, you know, and it's not by accident. He has determined the time that right now this is going to happen. He has determined the place that in Farmington there are going to be Indians. In Dearborn and Detroit there are going to be Arabs. That this year in Detroit there's going to be Afghans. That in Novi there's going to be Japanese and other Indian peoples. In Troy there's going to be everybody. And it's going to be all mixed together. It's not by accident. And it's not something that we need to fear or be afraid of, or like, ooh, we got to build up some bigger walls and protect our kids and protect our churches. And like, no, it's an opportunity. God has determined that all of these people coming from places where they really didn't have a really good opportunity to hear the gospel, now they are going to be living in our communities, in our neighborhoods, going to our schools, going to work with us. And we have the opportunity to go and make disciples. But we don't have to go around the world. We still need to do that. But sometimes we just got to go across the cube, got to go across the classroom, go across the cafeteria, and begin to engage people who are different from us. As God has moved them here and has given us these opportunities. We look at this passage and it says it's having determined allotted periods and boundaries. He's given the time and place. Why? Why has he done that? And what we see in this passage is that very, very important word, that. Whenever you see that in Scripture, say, okay, why is that there? What has been said? This, okay, here's the reason. Here's what's going to happen. That they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. God has moved people and determined where they're going to live at the time they're going to do it, that they would have an opportunity to seek him and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. It's not by accident. It's not because of some push of war or famine or some crazy thing in their country. It's not because of the pull of America, because, you know, we have so many opportunities. It's not for those reasons. It's God has done this. He's determined. You are going to live here at this time, that you would seek me, and perhaps you would find me. We're beginning to see more and more of that happen around the country, around the world, as people are beginning to move, people who had never had opportunities to hear the gospel. I'm going to share with you guys a couple stories of just seeing how God is at work in some of this. You can change the slide. This is just a random picture off the internet because we don't tend to show pictures that people were working with for their own security, and they'd hate to see their pictures up somewhere. But the first story is of a Sudanese girl. She's in college now. She's at Henry Ford College, kind of been here for a few years and got things going. But when she came to the States with her family, and her family had been in Sudan, and there was a huge war in Sudan, and they ended up in Egypt. They were in the slums of Cairo, living pretty quickly after they got there with mom and all these little kids. Dad said, "I'm out," and he left. So mom was left on her own in kind of these slums in Cairo, living in a country that was new, in a language that was somewhat new, all of these things, trying to survive. And they were in Cairo, the area, for about 11 years before they came to the States. But sometime during the end of that time, they met a Korean missionary, who we think was a missionary. They said it was a Korean friend. But when we put the story together, we think, okay, he's probably a missionary. But when they got to the airport, our friend went to pick them up, usually around midnight. That's when refugees tend to come in, is around midnight. And he's getting them, and he's saying, okay, I know I'm getting this Muslim family. And he speaks Arabic, so he's being able to talk with them a little bit. And he looks at the daughter, who's kind of college age, probably 19 at that time, and she's got her hijab on, but she's wearing a cross. And her friend Aaron's looking at her like, what is going on? Why is this Muslim girl in a hijab, obviously Muslim, wearing a cross? So he asked her about it and said, okay, I see the hijab. I know you're Muslim. Why are you wearing a cross? She said, well, when we were in Egypt, there was this Korean man that befriended our family and helped us and stuff. And I began to share a little bit with us. And he said, when you get to America, I'm going to pray that you will be able to learn more about God, that somebody will meet you that can tell you, more about who Jesus is, and gave her this cross. And so she's wearing this cross, and the first people she meets are these believers who welcome her and to love her, and beginning to see what God's doing. It's not like, okay, we need to go and take God to these people. Like, no, God's already at work. He's on the move. God is doing things from people from all around the world. So a Korean guy who is in Cairo ministering or doing business or something there connects to this family in the slums, befriends them, prays for them, and gives them this cross. And then they end up in America. And at that point, there were hundreds of people every month coming into Detroit. We had asked the refugee agency once, I said, well, how many people are like us, our small group trying to love a few people? How many people are involved? How many churches? And he said, nobody. You guys are the only ones. And we could take a family, 2 families, help, because no, there's hundreds of families that are coming in every month, and there's nobody. So for God to arrange that we're going to meet this family he's already at work with in Egypt, and say, okay, God, this is you. You're at work. Or if you go to New York City, one of our partnerships that we've been working on is with a group in New York City, and a couple of stories from them. This is a picture of Jackson Heights. Have you ever been to Queens? Kind of one of the first train stations when you get into Queens in Jackson Heights. It's one of the most diverse areas of New York City, one of the most diverse areas of America. I think they say in Queens, half the people have been born in a different country. So when you get off the train, that first stop, there's Nepalese and Indians and Pakistanis kind of there. If you keep going, you'll finally get to the new Chinatown area. But at that first stop, and you're kind of there, and it's busy and it's crowded and it's crazy. But there is a Filipino American who's part of the team there, and every day he gets up and he says, I go to the streets and I want to talk to people about Jesus. And he was a professional basketball player. In the Philippines, he owns a clothing company. He was a professional basketball player in the Philippines, played college ball here, very well-to-do. And he said, I'll keep my company and I'll run it from America, but I just want to go on the street and I want to tell people about Jesus. And he was doing what he does every day, kind of this half-shaved head, tall Filipino guy. And one day he was on the sidewalk like he normally is and sharing the gospel with somebody and beginning to talk. And he's got all these people walking by him and just the total craziness of that area. And a Tibetan stops and begins to listen in. And Noe is like, what is going on here? And finally he kind of stops his conversation with this other person and turns to this Tibetan who must have been, he knew it was Tibetan right away, so just the way he was dressed, looked at him and said, hey, can I help you? Are you lost? Just thinking he just needed directions. A lot of tourists come there and everybody's lost. And he goes, I had a dream last night. Could you help me with it? And he's like, sure, I guess. It's not my ideal, but, tell me, what's the dream? And he said, well, I had this dream and there was this clouds and then Jesus came down halfway and pointed at me. What does that mean? And he began to share the gospel to this Tibetan, in kind of this Indian neighborhood in Jackson Heights in New York City. And a guy came to Christ on the sidewalk with all these people and the craziness there. That's God at work. That's not Noe. That's not anything that anyone's doing. It's God saying, you know what, I'm going to put you here at this time. I'm going to put him there at this time. And you guys are going to meet. And he's going to come to know me. Another friend named Kevin was in Harlem. Harlem today has 100,000 West African Muslims. We have a few hundred, maybe a few thousand in kind of northern Detroit, Southfield, that area, or we call Little Africa here. They have 100,000. You go to these large African markets and you feel like you're in Africa. Well, one day Kevin is kind of doing the same thing and he's going from stall to stall, talking to people selling stuff on the street. And this guy comes up to him and says, can I ask you a question? And Kevin's like, sure. And he's wearing kind of this satchel or whatever, and he pulls out of it a scroll. And Kevin's like, okay, this is getting weird. Nobody has a scroll. But it's this little scroll, and he looks at it, and then he unscrolls it, and it's a picture of Jesus. And the guy says, who is this? I've got this somewhere, and I have no idea who this is. Could you tell me who this is? Well, this West African talked to this white guy in Harlem. It's, on the streets talking with, people and say, I need you to tell me who this is. And began to explain the gospel to him. And Kevin has a house church. It's part of a house church network in New York City for people just like this. And the guy's beginning to explore who Jesus is. And in that house church, there's an imam, the leader of one of the mosques in New York City, for 2 or 3 years now, has come every Sunday, faithfully worships with the house church, asks questions, sits under scripture, and then he goes, leads prayers at the mosque afterwards. But he's exploring. Who does that? Only God does that. God is at work in people's lives. He's determined that at this time they're going to live in this place and connect with these people. Why? That they may seek him, that they may find him. This passage, as we look at it, and you can change the slide, is for us as well, and it is for you. God has placed you at your place of work, at your home, wherever you live, a church in this community. You just go up and down the street and you see people from all different religions and stuff, but God has placed us here so that we may help people. We still have to go. We can't wait for them to come to us. Can't always wait for them to ask us questions. We have to go to them and say, I'm going to love you the way that Christ loved me. And it's just the idea of, just think of the Good Samaritan, of this person from a different country helping the person he's not supposed to help and just showing love. And Jesus says, who is the good neighbor? Who's the person that's really loving? It's like, it's the person who goes, who loves, who serves, and shares the gospel. We have these opportunities today. So today, the nations are coming to our doorstep. They are moving into our neighborhoods, going to our schools, working next to us, and building places of worship in our cities. We have to ask ourselves, are we really ready to engage them, to connect with them, to love them? It's going to cost us something. To get involved in someone's life always costs you something. Love is always sacrifice. And we have to be ready to do that, especially as we cross cultures and try to engage with people who are different than us, who eat different, talk different, trying to figure out, how do I connect with these Muslim families? And, okay, with a husband I can do this, and I get used to kissing guys. Saw the imam the other day and gave me 3 kisses, and I gave him 3 kisses, and say, this isn't normal, So you're learning new things and learning new ways to engage, with people. But we need to be able to do that. And I've been talking with Alex for a couple months now, trying to figure out some stuff. But one of the things we want to help the church with here is this workshop that's brand new for us called a Love Your Neighbor workshop. It's like, how do we begin to love people who are different from us? And this workshop is going to be November 16th from 9 to 1. But it's going to go kind of give a little intro to Islam. It's going to give an introduction to honor shame cultures and how does that work? How do we build bridges in different communities that are different from us? And we want to explore a little bit about missions and some different things. But we want to help you guys to say, hey, how do I reach this neighbor? How do I reach this person at work? How do I reach this person at school? I mean, the community we work in, we can work in there and we can invite people to come into the Detroit community and say, hey, come help us and meet these Afghan and Arab, friends of ours, and let's begin to reach them. But if we just reach that one little neighborhood, it's not going to reach Metro Detroit. It's not going to make the impact it could. If you begin taking the gospel to your place of work, to your neighborhood, to your school, then the gospel can really, really move forward. The work of God, the work of God's mission is not just the work of those that we call missionaries. It's the work of anyone who says, I am a child of God. I am a follower of Christ. If we're a follower of Christ, then we have to go and make disciples. And today, because of what God is doing, the going isn't always around the world, but sometimes it's just across the street. And we want to help you to do that. So I've got some flyers. Alex has some stuff. You can talk with Alex, but looking to come together with you guys. So Lisa and I will looking to be here. A couple who have served in Afghanistan for 20-some years are planning to be here and trying to gather a team that we can just begin to give you guys some skills and get over any sort of fears that there might be of like, okay, what does it look like to, make friends of a Syrian family or somebody in your neighborhood. So let's pray. Dear Father, I do just thank you and praise you for how you are at work around the world, for what